So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Boris Johnson kind of trying to force, Dyson and JCB. Well, not JCB as such, but he tried to push kind of big. Dyson's not really a British maker anymore, but is seen as British. To making ventilators for the UK during the height of the pandemic, the first wave. And the reason why he did that was to say that, we're Britain, we're strong, we don't need anyone else, blah, 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 blah. We've got Dyson, we've got JCB doing the work. And that kind of failed hard. And Dyson, this so-called patriot, he kept saying he wants to do the work for free, but he didn't want his employees in Britain being taxed. And so he contacted Boris Johnson directly for tax exemptions. When, if you're such a patriot, why would he care about his employees paying a bit of money in tax? He could have covered that. Or he could have just said, we're not doing the work for free. We need X amount of payment, and he could have used that money to cover the taxes. But he didn't, because he wanted to be seen as a British hero. That's what he wanted, I believe. But yeah, Boris Johnson assured James Dyson, Singaporean James Dyson, but he's moved his residency back to the UK, so maybe I should drop the Singaporean thing. His employees would not have to pay extra tax if they came to the UK to make ventilators during the pandemic. And I saw a title for a Guardian page which said that, why is it that it was only Dyson that were offered this tax exemption? Why wasn't anyone else that came to help the UK during the pandemic? It's very odd. And I think we know why. It's the fake patriot stuff. So Dyson, whose firm is now based in Singapore, it's not now based in Singapore, it's been in Singapore for a while, wrote to the Treasury to ask for no changes in tax status for staff. But in text message, so he lobbied the government directly, he messaged Boris Johnson directly. And you need to ask yourselves, how many people can do that? How many people do you know that own a business can contact the Prime Minister directly to ask for help? Not many, if any at all. So in text messages sent in March 2020, seen by the BBC, Dyson then went directly to the Prime Minister with Johnson saying, I will fix it. The government said it did everything it could to get the right equipment. That's a lie. That's a lie, and we'll be talking about that. That's a massive lie. And that's kind of the spin they're putting on it, and Labour have to push back against it. The opposition parties have to push back against it. Dyson said it was absurd to suggest that the urgent correspondence was anything other than seeking compliance with the rules. You weren't seeking to comply with the rules. You were seeking to circumvent the rules. If you were seeking to comply with the rules, then you wouldn't have asked for these tax exemptions, would you? And he said that his company did not receive any benefits from the project because for some reason they tried to design a new ventilator rather than just making the ventilators that are already legal. So I don't understand why he did that. Labour called the revelations jaw-dropping, with Lucy Powell saying, frankly, it stinks that a billionaire businessman can text the Prime Minister and get an immediate response and apparently an immediate change in policy. In the exchanges, the Prime Minister messaged Dyson saying that Rishi Sunak says he fixed it, we need you here. Why is he saying we need you here when there were already manufacturers of ventilators in the UK who weren't getting calls, who were told, nah, don't worry about it, we got it covered? So this is ridiculous. He saw, they put down the messages here and it looks more like conversation. So this was illustrated by the BBC. It says that, we are ready. This is Dyson, but nobody seems to want us to proceed. Sadly, James, that's his sign off. Boris Johnson, I will fix tomorrow. We need you. It looks fantastic, even though I don't think they even had prototypes. Rishi says he fixed it. We need you here. Thanks. I will give the ventilator our all. Dear Boris, I'm afraid that we need a response to our letter below because they contacted I think it was the Treasury, they contacted HMRC and HMRC didn't actually reply to them. He goes, James, I am First Lord of the Treasury and I can, and you can take it that we are backing you to do whatever you need. So Boris Johnson assuring him he would get tax exemptions. The great British patriot, he doesn't want to pay taxes. Fair enough. The messages have come to light amid an ongoing row over lobbying in Westminster, so this is really piling on the pressure on Boris Johnson. According to the Ministerial Code, a list of rules setting out the standards of conduct of ministers, a private secretary or official should be present for all business relating to government business. So they should... I don't know how clumsily I said that, but basically, if you're discussing business, if the government officials, ministers are discussing business, someone has to be there. A private secretary or official should be present for all discussion, so you have witnesses and someone to take notes. And if a minister finds themselves discussing official business without an official president, such as at a holiday or social event, which should not be happening, by the way, they should not be discussing government business with anyone outside of ours. It says that any significant content should be passed back to the department as soon as possible. But how do you define significant content? That's the problem. The code says ministers must act and take decisions impartially, fairly, and on merit, which is something they haven't done, using the best evidence without discrimination or bias. But there is widespread concern about formal contacts and lobbying between the government and businesses after revelations that David Cameron sent text to the Chancellor and ministers on behalf of failed finance Greensill. This is some crappy analysis from Laura Kuenssberg saying that lobbying can be absolutely legitimate. It's how Westminster lives and breathes when it shouldn't be the case. Who would object to a small charity approaching its local MP to ask for help? But the thing is, a local MP does not have the power the Prime Minister or any other minister has. That's why it's a ridiculous argument. All a local MP can do is speak to, if they're within, if they're the ruling party, they can speak to the ministers in charge, or if they're within opposition parties, they can mention it during whatever time is happening within the House of Commons. They can do a point of order, whatever, and ask for help. So this argument she's making is incredibly stupid. There are thousands of different circumstances in which having those discussions is perfectly valid. Yes, talking to your local MP about issues you have is perfectly valid. Speaking to the Prime Minister directly to circumvent HMRC or the Chancellor is not. Dyson was trying to respond to the urgent call for help at the start of the pandemic, when there was a deep and genuine fear that the NHS simply wouldn't have the equipment to look after thousands of people. So why is he asking for tax exemptions for? If the need was so necessary, he wouldn't have asked for an exemption. He would have come back and he would have helped, but he didn't. In the end, his project failed. He lost 20 million on it because instead of using existing blueprints for approved ventilators, he wanted to create some sort of new Dyson ventilator or something. The Prime Minister said the Prime Minister was heavily involved in efforts to get hold of ventilators and in touch with many businesses as the pandemic took hold. We'll mention that in a bit. But the rules that govern ministers' behaviour aren't just about what is being discussed, it's about how conversations are had. So, some BTEC analysis here from Laura Kuenssberg. Honestly, it's embarrassing sometimes. So when the coronavirus hit, there was a national call, calls for a national effort to help out. At the Department of Health, they feared that they would need 20,000 ventilators on top of the 5,000 it had, along with existing 900 to treat children. The reason why the NHS are so strapped for things like ventilators is because of the Conservative government and their cuts. So, in case anyone didn't know, the Prime Minister is understood to have called Dyson directly on the 13th. Surely your secretary should be doing this stuff. Dyson answered the call, said it spent 20 million pounds developing its own design instead of using approved blueprints. Why, Dyson? Why, James? Why? But the BBC discovered Mr. Dyson, whatever, also raised his concerns with the Treasury and later with the Prime Minister about rules that should see staff brought into the UK for the project needing to pay tax. He could have covered this tax bill. The man's a billionaire. Dyson Holding Company wrote an official letter to to the Chancellor, asking him to make sure HMRC, so he didn't write it to HMRC, he wrote it to the Chancellor, asking that HMRC would not change the tax status of companies or individuals who came to the UK to take part in the ventilator project, which, HMRC is right to do. That if you are doing business in the UK, you should be taxed, and you charge the government that money. That's what should have happened. In his letter, it said Dyson businesses are redeploying resources so that the national requirement for medical equipment can be met in the near term, blah, blah, blah. The bulk of this work will be carried out in the UK because this is where his R&D department is, and will require us to reassign senior individuals currently based outside the UK to work inside the country. It added, in this context, we would be grateful for your confirmation that HMRC will be instructed not to take points against individuals and corporate taxpayers that would otherwise be that would affect their tax positions whilst deployed in the UK. So, this is a billionaire. He could cover this stuff if he wanted to. He chooses not to. He chose not to. When the Treasury did not reply to his letter, probably because they probably realised how politically toxic it is, he contacted the Prime Minister directly. Responding to the exchange, a government spokesperson said, at the height of the pandemic, we had to work quickly, blah, blah, blah. Most of his stuff is not important. He's talking about how hard he worked and all this stuff. Dyson, government had been asking Dyson to start making ventilators, saying there's got to be a certain degree of understanding if we're in the middle of a huge crisis, but you didn't just ask them to make ventilators. For some reason, they were designing them, even though we had designs already. again, and if the government were so concerned, they didn't join the EU scheme. The people said that the government refused 50,000 ventilators. That's simply not true. It's more in the low hundreds. So, this is full fact here, talking about this, saying that the European Commission announced that it would stockpile emergency medical equipment, including intensive care equipment such as ventilators. And the reason why the EU do this as a bloc is because then they don't have to bid against each other, and it also enables them to get a lower price. So we saw in America, when it comes to PPE, different states were bidding against each other to get access to PPE, which drove the costs up rather than working together. There was no evidence for 50,000 ventilators. It does mention here that the scheme would have bought around 8,000 ventilators, which if you divide that between the 27 EU nations would be about 300 each, which isn't the most. It'd be just under 300, but is more than we had, and it would have come at a much better price. But this is claiming that if the EU managed to get half the price of ventilators, which is about 10,000 euros, which is optimistic at best, but they clearly weren't doing all that they could. The point is, the government clearly weren't doing all that they could to get ventilators because they didn't join this scheme when they could have done, and apparently it was for political reasons. Although the civil servant who made that claim has also retracted it. We can also see that Matt Hancock did plea to businesses to start making ventilators. He said anyone who can should. But we see from this article from Worcester News, which says that this company, G-Tech, were given the go-ahead on March the 20th to start coordinating and prepare production for ventilators. This is a British company, I believe. And then they were told on March the 26th that the government did not want them to proceed at the time. So this company could have made ventilators. They were told not to. The government instead favoured other companies. This is Keir Starmer talking about Tory sleaze. So we'll go here.
What does the Prime Minister think is the right thing to do if he receives a text message from a billionaire Conservative supporter asking him to fix tax rules?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I echo the Right Honourable Gentleman's remarks about Frank Judd. And can I say to him, in response to his question, that if he's referring to the request from James Dyson, I make absolutely no apology at all, Mr. Speaker, for shifting heaven and earth and doing everything I possibly could.
Blah blah. He's lying here, and the important point to make is that if he wanted to move heaven and earth in order to get these ventilators and things that we needed, why was he not talking to British manufacturers who were ready to go? Who were ready to go. All you had to do was give them the word, and you could have bought the ventilators and PPE and things like that off them. Instead, you're talking to James Dyson, a Singaporean businessman at the time, in order to get him to design and manufacture his own ventilators. So you didn't do everything you could, did you? Ridiculous. We go to Faisal Islam, the real G, Top Don, saying that's a very interesting story with the text messages from Laura Koonsberg. Illustrating it. He's saying at the time other manufacturers felt that in the key March 16th meeting the Prime Minister was especially keen to involve Dyson and JCB as manufacturer supporters of Brexit rather than car makers and aerospace. So it could be down to the fact that I believe Dyson and JCB are Conservative party supporters and donors, so maybe that's why JCB and Dyson were favoured, or it could be because these companies supported Brexit as well, so it kind of feeds into that stupid kind of nationalism that Boris Johnson is constantly pushing. So it says here, Faisal Islam was talking about manufacturers had quickly determined the ventilator challenge could only be met by using existing blueprints. So James Dyson didn't get the memo. So he goes on to say, Faisal Islam says that, and told me at the time they were bemused by focus on Dyson, whose plans did not proceed. At the same time, there was tension with car and plane makers who had begun to argue the pandemic would require an extension to Brexit trade negotiations to get deep deal that protected manufacturers. So, by doing that, manufacturers would be saved for another year, and also they could get in whatever parts they needed from the EU in order to build manufacturers here. A bit of context on Dyson, but some left on the call with the perception that the Prime Minister was overly focused on Dyson. Could it be because they're seen as a big, quote-unquote, British kind of manufacturer who are good at R&D, etc.? That's potentially the reason why he favoured Dyson, because they're kind of I don't know what the European perception is of Dyson as a company, but I think people in Britain see Dyson as kind of a big, company, world leading in vacuum cleaners and fanless, bladeless fans, etc. I don't know what the European perception is. Faisal Islam goes on to say, moot point perhaps, the ventilators from Dyson weren't approved nor mass manufactured, although JCB made some prototypes, and as I understand it, the ventilators that were made didn't end up being needed so much, but the perception in the industry of particular number 10 keenness. On the other hand, getting all hands on deck with whatever help needed in the middle of an emerging crisis, where compared to Europe we were desperately lacking in ventilators, might explain the general willingness to shake things up, as Mr. Blair alluded to on Tuesday. And per capita, we have some of the lowest ventilators in Europe, and that's a part of the NHS being underfunded massively. If you think these ventilators cost 20 grand each, Conservative Party don't want to pay for that. They don't want the government to pay for that. They want to give money to other things, tax cuts to their friends, etc. And what we can learn from this is that Boris Johnson went as far as to offer tax exemptions for Dyson employees in order to get Dyson involved in the project, as well as get JCB involved. I don't know if JCB wanted a tax exemption, I doubt it, but they didn't, go to companies that could actually manufacture the stuff, such as car makers and aerospace companies. He went to Dyson and JCB. That's the question, and I think we all know why. It's because these are the companies that supported Brexit vehemently. These are Conservative Party supporters. That's why. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.